Hey friends, so recently in my DMs I got a guy asking me something along the lines of how do I stop being a failure? Which is wow, it's a heavy question to ask, it's a heavy question to carry with you. And I, you know, I don't like the question, and I recommend dropping the question. But I mean you can explore it and experiment with it, tinker with it and try and understand where it's coming from because it's a loaded question in a sense, right? It begins with the assumption that you are a failure, and failure at what? What does it? And the way the question is asked implies that failure is a bad thing, and it often implies that it's a moral failure, like you're a bad person for failing at things. And the thing is, the way framing works, right? The way planning and conceiving and perceiving works, I think, is that it's very difficult to do, it's very difficult to work towards stopping X, right? Like it's because it's when you think about how do I stop being a failure, the thing that's foremost on your mind is how you are a failure, or I am a failure. Like it's just it that it has a way of reinforcing itself every step of the way, even as you're trying to work against it, right? Like it's like, don't think of a pink elephant, right? You're thinking it now. And so from the beginning you should flip it and be like, just ask yourself, okay, what does a person who is not a failure, again, I reject the premise, but suppose we go along with it for a while, what does a person who is not a failure look like? And you might say, oh, it's a person who succeeds, right? And then so that's the more interesting and compelling and enriching frame. How do I succeed? How do I become a success? And again, those things are too broad, too vague, too general, because no person is completely successful at everything, right? Everyone has failures and successes in their lives to different degrees in different environments and contexts at different times, right? So the question is, what are the things that you're failing at that you would like to succeed at instead, right? And there's layers to it. Like some failures you should be forgiving. Like you should want to drop the judgment, right? Because the judgment I found in my experience with my own life and with talking to other people, trying to there's something about negative judgment I found. I don't know how universal this is, but I found that we live up to our labels, even the negative ones. So like there's a saying in like classroom settings or whatever, right? Like if you talk about a kid like he's not gonna amount to anything, like he's a disappointment, or you don't expect much from them, they end up inhabiting that role that you've defined for them. Like if you're already gonna think of them as a criminal, then they might as well commit the crime, right? Since you're already kind of punishing them. And so what you want to do instead is give yourself, right, an ideal to live up to, and something to look forward to, something to make progress on. And so maybe you feel like you're a failure in your relationships or with your friends, or you feel like you're a failure at work, right? Like you're not meeting your deadlines at work, or your work's not good enough, or in school and you're doing badly in school. I never did well in school, so I don't know how to help with that. But I think the principles are roughly the same. I think it's like, how do I do well on this test, right? How do I do well at this? And then you have to define what success looks like. And like, okay, so I have to score well. To do well on a test, I have to get these questions right. And then you have to like what then you have to do all the questions that you know how to do. I mean, do all the questions on the test, right? You have these mock tests or whatever, and you find that there's a bunch of things that you don't know how to do. And I think what happens for some people is that again, failure is painful, and it shouldn't be painful. That's the thing. We it's the connotations around failure that make failure painful. And I found when I soak in the vibes of my favorite musicians and artists, that they have learned to find failure interesting and joyful, and like I played a note that wasn't what I intended, and it's deliciously bad. There's this jazz pianist Kenny Werner. He does this thing where he says, put your hand on the piano, like bang! It's just hot. It's this dissonant, discordant sound, and he puts his hand on it and he's like, how beautiful that is, like bang, and he accepts it. Like most musicians, I think, like if you accidentally play the wrong note, you flinch. You're like, I played the wrong note, fuck. And the thing is, when you flinch, you can't hear it properly. Like you've preemptively, oh no, I failed, right? You when you flinch from failure, you can't study it and you can't learn from it. And a phrase that's been evocative for me is that a sufficiently intimate understanding of failure is indistinguishable from success. Like a sufficient, if you understand precisely how and why a note is wrong, you will, it's like negative space, right? Like you will understand the note, that the notes on either side of that note sound good. And so when you make mistakes, don't, so again, I want to say don't feel bad about it, but so I should flip that and say try to feel good about it in a way. Like, again, good and bad are like, it's so vague and heavy, but it's like, try to be curious about what that mistake was and what is it about that context that makes it a mistake. Because almost anything, that, let's say you get in trouble for being, let's say you upset a friend for being too forward in or being too aggressive in conversation, like that doesn't mean that being aggressive in conversation is universally bad. There's something about that context that you did not appreciate that made you make the wrong move. There will be some other context in which being aggressive in conversation will get you rewarded and appreciated and like, wow, thanks for, like getting me out of that slump. Thanks for saying it like it is, or whatever. There are contexts in which each move or each note sounds good. And there are contexts in which there are different contexts in which those same notes sound bad or sound dissonant. And you want to develop an understanding of different contexts and different notes and how different notes work in different contexts. So we're using a musical analogy, but it also applies to everything else, right? And there's a period of time where I wasn't making videos every day and I was starting to feel bad about it. And again, it's the feeling bad that doesn't help. There's this post by The Last Psychiatrist where he has this 3-step tiered thing, which he says that being awesome is great, that's the top, right? Doing great, being awesome, that's great. But then there is feeling bad about not being great and beating yourself up about it. And then there is doing the work to get better. And what he points out is that it's easier and more enticing to beat yourself up about making mistakes than it is to be like, okay, but how do we get better though? How do we figure this out? How do we, so how do you stop being a failure? First of all, don't describe yourself that way. Like, it doesn't help, like you as a person, you're a whole universe, right? And you don't look at a cloud or a tree and say that cloud or a tree is a failure. There's people saying things like, there's all kinds of dogs, all kinds of cats, they're all lovable regardless of what nonsense they do, right? And similarly, you, with all your failures and mistakes and whatnot, you're a person, right? You're worthy, you are a work in progress. And if you describe that whole thing as a failure, that's ironically a failure of your imagination, because you're not seeing how you can transform into something else. So it's very meta. You don't have the right to call yourself a failure. You know what I mean? It's you don't know enough. You don't have enough context to judge yourself that way. And very often when people are self-loathing and they hate themselves, it's a kind of narcissistic self-flagellation where you are beating yourself up and you feel like the you that's getting beaten up feels bad and sorry, I'm such a terrible person, I'm so bad, I'm so sorry, fucked up, and then you get angry, hey, what the fuck, man, like. But the part of you on top that's beating on the part of you that's below, that part on top is somehow beyond reproach, right? People don't stop to examine and ask, why does this part of me have authority over that part of me, right? Who gave, who made you king, right? Who made you the arbiter of my feelings and and so on? And very often that's inherited from society. It's inherited from parents. It's inherited from teachers, And those people very often, they when they act out that way, right, when they're being mean to you or cruel to you or harsh, they aren't doing it with your development and growth top of mind. It isn't optimizing for your development and growth. It's usually you frustrated them, you've annoyed them, and they don't know how to handle it in a graceful way, or they don't want to. Like, they are tired and busy, and then they lash out, right? They snap at you, they yell, and you internalize that, and then you snap at yourself and yell at yourself, and then you're miserable on the inside. So try to let that go, right? I find that exposure to musicians and artists and people who have this kind of forgiving, I don't know if even forgiving is the right frame, because people say things like, people sometimes view it as some kind of dichotomy where, like, do you forgive bad things or do you not? Do you tolerate bad things or do you not? And that's, both of those things are very in the moment, but reality is more than just the present moment, right? It's an ongoing thing, and you have to you want to be aware of future possibilities. So to circle back to the question, how do you stop being a failure? Decide to focus on becoming successful, achieving success in some small task that you care about, right? So even if, I'm such a failure in so many ways, like, okay, like, if you bring it all the way down to the basics, like, have you had a glass of water? Can you successfully pour yourself a glass of water and drink it? Done. You've succeeded at drinking that glass of water. You've succeeded at taking care of yourself a little bit. Now, can you clear your desk of any junk? Can you put all the junk? Can you clear the trash from your desk and your table and whatever else? Do it. Done. You've succeeded at that other thing. And so you want to accumulate small successes, as many as you can. And over time, those successes allow you to incubate a new story that you tell yourself, and eventually this story can replace the old story where you frame yourself as someone who is struggling and failing and screwing up, which doesn't mean that you're not struggling and failing and screwing up, but it doesn't need to be the central narrative of your life. Done.